Hey guys, so many of you requested more Paper 1 Part A essays, and obviously I try to respond to your requests as much as I can. So I recorded this Paper 1 Part A essay about the effects of tariffs on different stakeholders. Actually, I'm sorry, it's a Paper 1 Part B. It's a 15-mark question, not a Paper 1 Part A. This question was actually assigned as homework for the students. So they didn't take it under exam conditions in class. They didn't write it by hand. They actually typed it up. And this is one of my students' essays that scored a 13 out of 15. So it's a level 5. It's not perfect, but that's why I chose it. I wanted to use it as a sort of learning experience to give feedback on it, but also to show you how to construct a Paper 1 Part B essay in any topic in the global economy unit. Now, before I continue, remember, this was typed up. It was a take-home essay, and the students were assigned an article. We read an article in class, and they had to incorporate the ideas in the article as part of their real-world example. So that's why there might be a little bit more detail with the real-world example in this essay, and I'll talk about how it would differ if it was actually written by hand under exam conditions. But before I continue, please remember, hit subscribe, comment, like. If you want access to more exclusive content, my channel membership is growing. Become a member. All the links to becoming a member or supporting this channel can be found in the video description below. I would definitely recommend becoming a member of my channel. All right, let's get started. So the question was, using real-world examples, evaluate the effects of a tariff on different stakeholders. Now, this is, as I said, a Paper 1 Part B, which means it's a 15-mark question. And ideally, if you're writing it by hand under exam conditions, it should be written in 45 minutes. So how did they begin their essay? Let's see. In order to effectively answer this question, a key term must be defined. A tariff is a tax that is placed on imports in order to protect domestic industries from foreign competition and to raise revenue for the government. With this term defined, we can continue on to answering the question at hand. The economic theory most relevant to the prompt or the question is that of trade protection. Trade protection is a general economic policy of restricting imports from other countries. It can foster self-sufficiency, as well as putting foreign competitors at a disadvantage. Tariffs are one of the many kinds of trade protection. So the student has defined key terms and introduced basically the umbrella economic theory that this topic falls under. And then you have the diagram, okay? So here it says price of Chinese goods, quantity of Chinese goods. I think something that was missing that I did comment on their essay is that price of Chinese goods imported into America, right? Because here the foreign producers are the Chinese producers and the domestic market is the US market. Or actually, it could just be, instead of Chinese goods, it could be something like price of electronics, for example, price of plastic toys, things that are commonly imported from China. So this is one comment that I gave them, all right? Because price of Chinese goods and the domestic market being the USA was a little bit confusing. So just remember, you can just pick something that China is famous for exporting, like plastic toys or manufactured electronics or whatever. Okay, so then you have the domestic demand in the USA, the domestic supply curve, and then you have the world supply. Here, the student labeled it as China, and then as China plus tariff. The student also labeled the government tariff revenue and the welfare loss. In the diagram, the price of Chinese goods rises from PC to PC plus T, okay? So this price here to this price plus the tariff. And the domestic production, and this is the tricky thing. When they say the domestic production of Chinese goods, that doesn't really make sense. So that's why, again, some comments on how you should label your diagrams. But here, what they mean, or what the student means, is the price of domestic production of whatever good that is being imported from China. So maybe it's plastic toys, whatever. Domestic production will increase from QS-DOM to QS1, which makes domestic producers, obviously in the US, better off, okay? So domestic production increases from QS-DOM to QS1. Perfect. Additionally, domestic consumption decreases from QD-DOM to QD1, which makes American consumers worse off. Import levels decrease from the difference between QS-DOM and QD-DOM to the difference between QS1 and QD1. which makes foreign producers, in this case Chinese producers, worse off as well. The US government is earning tariff revenue equal to PC plus T minus PC times the difference between QD1 and QS1, which is positively benefiting the US government. The green highlight square signifies the revenue gained by the government, and the gray triangles show the welfare loss in basically in the United States. So I gave them some feedback about how the diagram should have been labeled a little bit more generically. Instead of price of Chinese goods and supply from China, just pick a specific good like price of electronics or price of plastic toys and label this S World and S World plus tariff. That was some feedback that I gave them, okay? I am doing this to show you how, even though this is a high-scoring essay, there was still room for improvement. Okay, a real-world example. Now remember, this real-world example was taken from an article that I gave the class. A real-world example comes from an article written by Alexandra Alper and Andrea Shalai about the United States tariffs on Chinese goods. You do not have to memorize the authors of articles, by the way, when you give real-world examples. That's because this was a take-home essay and I gave them an article. Until China has met their required purchase of U.S. goods, President Biden is unwilling to lower the imposed tariff. In regards to stakeholders gaining or losing, Chinese producers are put at a disadvantage from the tariff because the purchase of their goods will severely decrease. They will have to lower the prices of their goods significantly to be able to compete with domestic producers. According to Xu Zhiting, a spokesperson from Chinese Ministry of Commerce, the removal of the imposed tariff would also benefit the global economy, especially in time of high inflation. Okay, and this is because a lot of countries import Chinese goods and they rely on Chinese imports. And there is, at least in the developed world, in the MEDC world, there's high inflation. So removing tariffs will actually, because a lot of Chinese imports are raw materials that go into other industries, removing those tariffs will actually lower the costs of production and basically lower the inflation rate. So this statement, of course, is partially biased to China's wishes, but there is some truth to it as well. Imported goods become more expensive for US importers, and they often pass these costs onto consumers rather than incurring the cost themselves. This raises prices and increases inflationary pressure. So you can see the student here really dug deep and elaborated on what they mean by the inflationary pressure. Where Chinese producers are put at a disadvantage, American domestic producers are given benefits. I think what they mean is benefit from this situation. By raising the prices on imported Chinese goods, domestic producers will have no need to engage in price competition, making their products increasingly more favored because of the price difference. They can set the mark on where they want their prices, most likely raising them because of the increased costs of production from foreign Chinese imports, and can do so without much backlash. Consumers will most likely choose to buy it rather than not, so they will have to comply with raising prices. This puts US consumers at a disadvantage because they directly suffer from raising prices, which will either limit their accessibility to goods or put them at a greater financial strain. The greatest risk to continued tariffs, even after China's vocal wishes to lift them, is the risk of a possible trade war. China and the United States have continued to have long-standing tensions over the years, and with two global economic superpowers, it is not unlikely that a trade war could emerge. A trade war will hurt the US economy, stagnating growth, as well as hurting producers by raising their costs of production. With that, US consumers will suffer the brunt of the trade war. Not only will prices of goods rise, but because of the increasing costs of producing, unemployment could also spike dramatically. This is actually very good evaluation that's weaved into the RWE, the real world example. And this is why this student did really well, even though there were some errors. I wouldn't say major errors, but confusing errors in the labeling of the diagram. The evaluation and the real world example is actually really good because it does respond to the demands of the question, which is evaluate the effects of tariffs on different stakeholders. And here the student talked about lots of different stakeholders. In conclusion, the issue surrounding US imposed tariffs on China is quite complicated. The US wants to appear resolute as a powerful force in upholding China's end of economic deals, but at the same time, they have to be able to realize the smartest path of least resistance. If they push too hard and stay too strong, a trade war could very well ensue, and there's no American benefit to that. Okay, so this student scored a 13 out of 15. I told them that their evaluation and real world example was excellent, but they kind of lost some marks, or they missed that 14 and 15 mark because of some errors in labeling the diagram. However, overall, the student does define key terms. The student does explain relevant economic theory. The student evaluates and actually addresses the demands of the prompt while weaving in a really good real-world example, which is how President Biden has decided to actually continue the tariffs that his predecessor, President Trump, had imposed against China, because China is not meeting their end of this trade deal. And I am about to sneeze. Okay, I don't think so. Thank God, because we don't want that on camera. Okay, so once again, as I said, 13 out of 15, evaluations good, real world examples good. You do not have to memorize names of authors of articles, but take something that you've read in the news and kind of weave it into your evaluation, okay, so that it is relevant. This student took the article, which is about how President Biden is deciding to continue the tariffs set by his predecessor because China has not met their end of the trade deal. And then the student evaluated how that would affect Chinese producers, American domestic producers, American domestic consumers, as well as the government and the the global allocation of resources. So yeah, this was a good essay. It's not perfect, and I talked about some of the ways to make it better, but just an example of what a paper 1 part B question about tariffs or maybe quotas or export subsidies or production subsidies could look like. Once again, hit subscribe, like, share, comment, leave a comment. I reply to all of my comments, and become a channel member. You'll see lots of exclusive content that will rock your world, and hopefully you'll get a really good grade in IB Economics. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye.